Imagine buying your first home, doing everything you think you need to do to avoid making mistakes. Well done. But then after moving in, you find it's so badly termite infested with live termites that it needs to be demolished. How could this nightmare have been avoided?
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for you to become an educated home buyer.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. But it's a good thing because between us we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on. Allow us to guide you on your home buying journey. We want you to become an educated home buyer so that you can stop looking for your first home and actually become a proud homeowner.
We've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au, and there you'll get access to our free mini course, How to Price a Property Like a Professional. You will also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to become educated home buyers. We created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, we've got the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording. Things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority and your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today we're bringing you another property disaster that's hit the news. It's a terrible tragedy for a young couple who bought a home without realising it was being eaten away by termites. We'll unpack the story and find out whether this could have been avoided. But before we get into that, there's a special house behind you this week, Megan, or a special roof
It's
cavity.
a bit of a visual. So this is what termite damage looks like in the rafters of a roof, and this is what a building inspector will get up and have a look at. Now, building inspector may or may not deem that this is a structural issue. So sometimes they're just, surface. So some of these areas, if you're looking, some of these areas are just kind of surface issues, but some can really go right into the timber. So we're going to talk about that. There's varying degrees of issues when it comes to termite damage.
Yeah, absolutely. In my long career in real estate now, we've come across the gamut, and a lot of it's hidden too. But when it's live, there's sort of no excuse for a building inspector to miss it, right? When they're actually in there chomping away. So this is the story, right? This couple bought their two-storey home in a suburb in the Gold Coast called Eleanor, right? They bought it back in 2019. And at the time, they actually got a building and pest inspector who told them that he'd carried out a thermal scan of the property's timber beams. And he said there was no visible evidence of termite activity or damage. And I guess the very first thing is when you get someone who's told you that they've done something and it's a scan, oh, that sounds like an image to me. I want to see a picture. I want to see evidence. But anyway, they didn't get it.
Yeah, let's talk about what that looks like, Veronica, because we're talking about in a lot of these instances, these things happen between the walls. So you've got an outer of the wall, you've got an inner of the wall, and then you've got the timber beams that are inside the wall. So this is where
the frame,
it's hard because you can't see it, but there is technology that allows a building inspector, licensed building and pest inspector, to use what's called a thermal scan, and it picks up basically the heat of the body of the live termite. So whilst it is incredibly difficult to pick up past termite damage within walls, and that can be missed, and look, I've bought properties where it's been missed. I've bought properties where I knew it existed. But in this case, we're talking about live termites where that scan should have seen the image of the warm body or the body inside those wall cavities.
It's a long time since I've actually gone through a house with a building inspector with one of those little scanny things, which is, when I say it's an image, it doesn't actually come up with an image. It's like a little
picked up the heat
machine that sort of goes ding, 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 and sort of glows red, So there's sort of and we'll get into how this could have been avoided as we go on, but I mean, this is pretty awful when actually live termites, because 3 months after moving in with their 2 young children, they found termites crawling out of a power socket in the bathroom. And then they were, oh my God.
Oh God, I can't imagine it.
Awful. I've lived in a townhouse years ago. I was renting one where one day I went into the bathroom and I just noticed out of the door jamb, right? I thought, if I didn't know better, I think that's termite refuse, right? And this was only 2 years old. It was rented, as I said, it wasn't mine. And I went to the strata manager and I said, or the property manager first. They went to the strata manager. I said, I think they've got termites in here. Do you know what? I sprayed Baygon in that hole and you could hear them screaming in the walls.
Oh, God.
How gross is that?
Anyway, that's not recommended. Everybody, that is not the recommended way to exterminate termites. You don't, they'll just relocate.
But it's a good experiment if you happen to find them. And look, no one wants to be inside a room that you know there are live termites in the walls. But anyway, these poor people, they noticed them climbing out of a power socket. Then they started looking through the house and they discovered that the house was riddled. And this isn't termite damage from past activity that's been addressed and stopped. This is active. And I can tell you right now, I'm not a pest inspector. I'm not an expert here, but I would suspect a 2-storey home needs more than 3 months to be completely and utterly infested, to the level that what happened here was that they had to demolish the house because it was deemed too dangerous to live in. Those termites had basically undermined or gnawed their way through every structural beam and truss and frame in that house to the point that it was dangerous, right?
Yeah, I just think about it. Termites aren't that good with hardwood, but they love
softwood.
They love softwood, so that you often find them in the skirting boards and those sorts of things. So they often don't permeate into the framework because often it's hardwood. But when they do a different story, and of course you can't see that until you take a sheet off the front. So that's a hard thing. But
here's the thing though, a building inspector, right? You've got a picture of a roof cavity behind you, right? Now, not every house has a roof cavity. Not every house has a roof cavity. Not every house, some houses have flat roofs, so you can't get in the roof there. Some houses don't have manholes. Like, you should have one. And if you buy a house that doesn't have a manhole, then the building inspector will say, I can't get up in the roof, and you should cut a manhole in somewhere. Likewise, under the house, some houses don't have subfloor access. If you don't have subfloor access, then you should get subfloor access, because the building inspector, pest inspector will say, I can't get under there. I can't guarantee there's nothing, you know. Yeah. But when they do thermal imaging, they're basically saying, well, there's nothing live under there. They can't say that there hasn't been anything live. They can't say that previously, you know, there's been damage or hasn't. They won't be able to say any of that. So there's all these disclaimers in the building and pest inspection report. And so certainly when you've got a property where you've got access to these areas, you want to make sure that that building inspector has been in those areas and
taken photos.
Got photos. Yeah,
Take
exactly
photos.
Right.
Now, what they found out later was that the property had earlier failed a pest inspection commissioned by another buyer. Mm-hmm. So this starts to tell us that there may have been some prior knowledge. Now, this property is in Queensland, where there's not a lot of seller disclosure, okay? But there is, you can't misrepresent. Now, those inspection reports also seen by the organisation that was the ABC, I think this article was, where you found it?
So, the article's in the ABC. We'll put the link in the show notes. Yeah. And so before writing the story, the ABC looked at this evidence. So they saw this and saw the previous inspection report and found severe, in inverted commas, severe widespread termite damage, and warned that there was a high risk of undetected additional damage. So, and the house was assessed in below average condition because of structural defects like wood rot, moisture, and drainage issues. So all of these.
There's a whole lot of other things going on as well.
And also wood rot, moisture, and drainage issues are the sorts of things that termites love. They love moist, damp, soggy timber. Yum, yum.
Yeah, and more. Oh, we have a lot of them in Queensland. Now, this is where we want to come to, okay? So we're not having a go at building inspectors here. That's not what this is about. It's a bigger picture. One, maybe it should have been picked up because they were live, hard to detect, old damage.
I don't think
easier to
maybe
find
we'll get to definitely they should have been picked up.
But the investigation found that the prospective buyer had sent those reports to the real estate agent, but the agent wasn't obliged to disclose those defects to any future buyers, even though they're aware of it.
And now we bang on all the time about the legislation on vendor disclosure is different in every state and territory all the time. Queensland currently has a situation where there's not much that the owner has to tell you and not much that the agent has to tell you. That is in the wings to change, but God knows how long that will be. Yeah. And that has been in the wings for 6 years and still hasn't changed. So the reality is that that agents only have to tell you certain things, and what they have to tell you in different jurisdictions will differ. To assume that the agent should tell you this sort of stuff is dancing with danger.
Yeah. And a property lawyer who was quoted in the article said, silence is not misrepresentation in the eyes of the law. If you're selling something and you keep, in brackets, defects, to yourself, then you have no liability. Now, this is so important to understand because they haven't misrepresented the property unless they are asked a direct question. Which of course we teach people to ask direct questions.
Yes, we do. And it's one of the reasons why we created Your First Home Buyer Guide, the course, because a lot of people just assume that you should in inverted commas, be given this information. And in an ethical sense, yes, you should. But the reality is that in different jurisdictions in this country, it's not actually a requirement on agents to pass on some of this information. And we'll get to that because even where there are vendor disclosures, even then in some cases it's not a requirement. So this is the scary stuff. And what we want to make sure is that you as first home buyers don't make avoidable mistakes. That's why we actually have a course to teach you the process to go through step by step so you can avoid these mistakes. But this is a really tricky one because it's a really common belief that I should be told this. It's really common belief, but it's a fallacy.
It is. And the buyers themselves say it seems like there are many loopholes for everybody except the buyer. And yeah, it can sort of feel like that. Yeah. But I think there are things that could have been done here. And the biggest thing I think for us is that could seller disclosure laws have prevented this?
The answer is maybe.
If they were in place, like everything in property, maybe. There's an exception in some circumstances. You and I would love to see a higher level of seller disclosure. If a seller knows something about a property, it's my personal belief that they should reveal it. And
but that's an ethical belief.
Yeah,
Hardly.
They had to know it. It's not a legislative belief, by the way.
Exactly.
And look, there's no absolutely, there's been places that I've bought that afterwards have gone, I don't know how I could have found that out. I don't know, I don't know if there's anything else I could have done differently. And I'm in the industry. I know what I'm doing, but I know the owners must have known about that.
Yep. Yes. We had a similar situation recently in our business where one of my team bought a property and the building inspector raised an issue with drainage and said, I would recommend you get this dealt with. And because what could happen in a particularly heavy deluge is that you could get flooded. And so it's pointed out that our buyer's agent spoke to the client about that risk and said, well, this is obviously something that's high on your list of things to do when you buy the property, get this drainage put in. And what should happen? A deluge a few days later, which did result in a flood. And so that happens, right? The owner is then going, oh my God. And so owner goes to insurance and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, long story short, the insurance will fix it. But the reality is the drainage problem is still there. And my clients now know that, well, absolutely we need to get that fixed. It's been identified as a weak point in the property. And now we've got evidence that, yes, it is a weak point, and this is a very good reason why you should address this. And certainly when you're looking at building and pest inspections, and this is where we talk about in your first home buyer guide, where we guide you through what to look at, what questions to ask their building inspector, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things is that there's like a checklist of things to do when you own a property to keep maintaining it and keep it in peak condition. And that's the sort of thing you need to address. Now, when you're dealing with vendor disclosure around a property, it's a massive grey area. Even in areas like in New South Wales and Victoria, for example, there's states where the vendors have to disclose quite a lot to buyers compared to Queensland or say WA or maybe Tasmania. However, there's a grey area as to what should be disclosed. Like, is it up to me to disclose this? You know, you would have obviously the owners knew they were live. Obviously,
there's no way you couldn't have not, surely, because they actually are noisy.
They are, and if that
they are noisy,
just spray some bacon in. You know how much noise they make. They do. You can hear them chomping. But also, the agent had that previous building inspection, pest inspection, which did point to a really high risk. Now, they may have just went, well, high risk is not the same as active termites. Perhaps they just, justified it to themselves. But there is a lot of grey area in all jurisdictions as to what is needed to be passed on versus what is buyer beware or relying on the buyer to actually uncover and make their own investigations. But as a buyer, you have to take responsibility for your investigations, because even though ultimately these guys did win an insurance payout, but these things never cover all the costs. You never get enough back to cover the cost of, in this case, you have to rebuild the house. You never get enough back that's going to cover all your legal costs. You never get enough back. You get some compensation, but you're still out of pocket. And so who wants to put themselves through that? Like, really and truly, there are better ways to go about buying a property than hoping that there's insurance that you can claim on if necessary. You really want to be head of the eight ball there.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that we've got to keep in mind is that there is always risk in buying property. You can never be completely risk-free. There are things that can't be seen. There are things that can't be found. So there are risks in buying property. You can cover as well as you can those risks by asking the right questions. I mean, the thing that I'm really curious about is, where did they find their building inspector? Did the agent recommend them, or was it friends, or was it online? Did they check out the insurance of the building inspector? Had they been around for a long time? Did they have good reviews? Did they provide photos? Did they provide images from the scans? I know that the building and pest inspection reports that we get, we actually have screenshots of the scans, so thermal image scans. Now, that's not to say that that's every timber beam in the property it has a photo, but if they think that they've found anything, they'll send them through. But it's important to get recommendations on these companies from people you trust, like a conveyancer or a buyer's agent, or somebody who has not just used somebody once and had a good experience with them, because that's not really testing something. But, another person that's bought many, many properties over a long period of time would be a good one to go to.
Yeah.
A building inspector who's found issues for somebody else is a good one to go to.
That's exactly right. It's important to realise that a lot of building and pest inspectors also don't have insurance. That's a bit shocking, but it is true. Now, thankfully, in this case, this inspector did have insurance, but there's a huge risk apparently. And I think it was Michael Ferrier from Ion, who said that something like, I'm pulling his figure out of the air, but something like half the building inspectors don't have insurance. Like, it's a huge percentage don't have public professional indemnity insurance, which is what you're after. Yeah. So you must check for that.
Yeah, you must. And if you are going to rely on a building and pest inspection that's been done by on behalf of somebody else, so say you're going to an auction and you're provided with a building and pest inspection. Now, we do this on some occasions. If that inspector has been someone that we would use in the normal course of our business anyway, we're happy to rely on that, because we know that person has had to be thorough in providing that report and not leave things out for the benefit of the seller. Yeah. But the thing you need to make sure is that you get it transferred to your name, so that if something like this does happen, then you'll be able to make a claim against their professional indemnity insurance if the claim is available to you.
Yeah. Now, in the article, the REIQ's legal counsel was interviewed for the article, and to quote from her, she said, "At the moment, due diligence is done by the buyer after signing the contract." And that is the way it's generally done. But we really do encourage a lot of this to be actually done before you sign a contract, even in Queensland. And it's not always possible to do that. And if it's not possible, you need to have the right conditions in place in your contract, and you need to have the right legal advice. And so what often happens is that, just that quote, due diligence is done by the buyer after signing the contract. In Queensland, for example, it's very easy to sign a contract without needing any legal advice. So you can actually see how very easy it is to get yourself into a situation where you don't know what due diligence needs to be done. You've already committed to the property. You haven't got the conditions in there that protect yourself because you haven't got the right advisors giving the advice in the right order, doing things in the right order. So very different. Every state's different, right?
And every state is different, yeah. Generally speaking, a private treaty offer in Queensland will be subject to and generally finance and building and pest inspection unless it's a highly competitive market, and then buyers might improve their chances by removing those conditions. Now, again, that's a risk that you might be prepared to take. It's probably one that we would advise against, but it's always up to you. As long as you understand the risks of doing that, then the ball's in your court to deal with the consequences if something's found afterwards.
And when you understand that risk, that means you have full appreciation that the agent isn't obliged to tell you a lot of stuff that you think that they should be telling you. And so that's where people will often take risks, not realizing that they are actually taking risks because they're operating under a false assumption that they should be told stuff that actually they shouldn't be told. We can say ethically they should, but legally...
Yeah. Oh, we'd like to see it.
Yeah.
But then it comes down to cost as well, because the Queensland government has passed new laws on vendor disclosure, but it's still deciding when to bring the laws into effect. And it's yet to define exactly what relevant information sellers will have to disclose. Now, they've got a fairly good idea. There is a list, and the REIQ is doing a roadshow at the moment, helping people understand that. At this point in time, it's estimated that the cost to put a property on the market for a seller is going to go from $0 to about $1,500 in terms of the documents and information they're going to have to supply under that new regime. So that's an estimate at this point in time. So it's going to really change the landscape of how properties are brought to market in Queensland, because that's not been anything that anyone's had to do before, invest any money before they actually sell their property.
Yeah.
It's a big change around. Our property laws are 50 years old. The reforms are the result of a government commission review by the Queensland University of Technology in 2018. And that review made more than 230 recommendations. So there's a lot of improvement that can be made, but these wheels are slow to turn, and there are people on both sides of the ledger who are impacted when you bring laws like this in.
Yeah. So buyers must beware. Even when these changes come through, they won't be complete. They won't be as robust and thorough as what we would like to see, because you've got people on the selling side go, but I don't want to have to pay that much money to put my property in the market. So there's all this compromise and the politicisation of it as well, when you've got lots of vested interests. So buyers have to beware, and things will improve in Queensland, but there still will be areas that the buyer has to take responsibility to research. And this is something that is the case everywhere, even in Victoria and New South Wales. So what happened to the couple? Well, ultimately, they reached a confidential settlement with the professional indemnity insurer of the building and pest inspector. But even then, they estimate that the ordeal cost them $300,000 because they had to demolish the entire house. The entire house was unlivable. So it's not like they bought this house thinking, we're going to renovate this, and so it sort of doesn't matter if there's a bit of damage because, we can knock that bit off and we're going to rebuild it anyway. They literally couldn't keep any of it. So they had to borrow more money and rebuild on the same block. So fortunately, they're able to. So they end up with a home, which is not as bad an outcome as it could have been, but certainly an awful, awful situation for them to have gone through. Now,
it could have been a little less avoidable, a little more avoidable than the others that we've covered in previous episodes. We talked about some fairly distressing situations for people that have found themselves missing something in the process or not doing their due diligence as thoroughly as they could have. But the key takeaway, I think, that would have helped them avoid this is that the assumption that these things should be disclosed is really dangerous. And even though there's different levels of disclosure in different states, it does leave all home buyers quite vulnerable. And it's on you to know what to look for and how to protect yourself. And that's why we created Your First Home Buyer Guide, the course that actually steps you through how to do these things.
That's exactly right. And as Megan said earlier too, I would just add in that you got to remember there are still some things that are undiscoverable. You know, some stuff is hidden in a property, and you have to understand that when you go ahead with the property. And certainly when you read the disclaimers on a building and pest inspection report from a good building and pest inspector, there's going to be a bunch of disclaimers there about what they can't get access to, what they can't see. So you've got to be aware of that. But certainly in this situation, the reason that this was avoidable really was because they were live. They were chomping away at that entire house, and that building and pest inspection should have found that. So really, I guess you get to the point where, in this case, there's the choice of inspector, and that whole catastrophic domino effect that comes from that, which is really terrible. And I'm glad that they've got a home. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Quick note, you might think we cover everything you need to know in this podcast, but a word of warning, we don't. We just scratch the surface here. If you really want to be an educated first home buyer, you need to learn all the steps and how to do everything in the right order.
You know, our first home buyer guide course only costs $990, and you get direct access to us every week, and we can help guide you through your negotiations. You can also share the link of any property you're thinking about buying. We can help you work out whether it's A, B, C grade, or a no-go zone. We can even talk to you about your choice of building inspectors if you want. Now, trust me, you'll buy better with our guidance, and you'll overpay by a hell of a lot more than $1,000 if you don't know what you're doing.
In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out your first home buyer guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you've found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.